Namaste and a warm welcome to the Ex-Christian Show, the insider view of Christianity from the outside. Is the Bible a divine handiwork? That is the question we are examining in a series of videos, and this is part 3 of it. If you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, I recommend you watch them first. The links to the two videos are in the description below. In the first two parts, we saw contradictions and absurdities in the Bible. In this part, we will deal with the exaggerations in it. A Tanakh is a Jewish scripture which the Christians borrowed to build their own religion on and renamed it as the Old Testament. And I prefer using the word Tanakh for the Old Testament going forward. The Bible obsesses over unimportant details like how many males returned from an exile, or how many of them were slaves and how many masters, or of the total number of sacrificed animals, how many were goats over the age of 1 year, or how many bulls over 1 year. But strangely, it glosses over the more important questions like how salvation is attained. It gives two contradictory messages in that regard. Another strange aspect is that even in the case of a very large number, say something like in the hundreds of thousands, the Bible insists on using so-called exact numbers instead of approximations as we ordinarily do. Why would we need exact numbers to report factual events? We usually round off a number, right? Now let me give you an example. In the biblical book of Exodus chapter 38 in verse 26, the Bible reports that the number of men above the age of 20 that were rescued out of slavery in Egypt was 603,550. One would wonder how many people were involved in taking the census and for how many days. Now, if you did not know, there's a whole book in the Bible that is dedicated to this aspect. It's called the Book of Numbers. In chapter 3 of this book, the Israelite God commands Moses to count the number of people in his family by age group. Moses arrives at a figure of 22,273 firstborn males, a month old or more. What is the sanctity of such exactitude? You know, the Bible is dead silent about how Jesus lived his adolescence and his adulthood. And Christians defend this silence, saying the all-intelligent God dropped it from the Bible because it's too trivial to the central message of Christianity. Trivial? How the alleged savior of mankind lived in this realm is trivial? The believers are expected to fashion their lives after him. His youthhood would have been a model for youngsters, right? Now, this fact is nothing compared to the next example I'm going to give. This must be the most eccentric account in the entire Tanakh. It's in the book called Ezra. But there is a problem with this report. It doesn't seem to have been given by a being whose divine duty it is to maintain a balance in a massive universe replete with billions of stars and planets on thousands of galaxies, and also monitor the functioning of millions of plant and animal species. Wouldn't it be common sense to ask, why would the creator of the entire mankind leave everything else happening at that time with the rest of the ethnicities of the world and be bogged down by trivialities of one race? This is a classic example of messing up of priorities. And an all-intelligent being cannot mess up anything, much less priorities. The Bible could simply do without the whole book of Numbers. That is, if it is taken as a divine work. But it makes perfect sense if the Bible is seen as a human work. Now, Judah, the nation of the early Jews, was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, and Judeans were exiled to Babylon. 50 years later, in 539 BCE, Babylon was conquered by Persians. The Persian king Cyrus sent the exiles home. Some exiles availed the opportunity to leave and some did not. Cyrus retained Judah as a Persian province and made Ezra the governor of the province. Ezra was also a scribe and a priest and a prophet. He is the author of this report. So why did Ezra think it necessary to report the numbers in such great detail? Note that Ezra's primary goal was to reinstate the Jewish commonwealth as a theocracy. An exact head count of who returned from the exile was necessary for political and administrative purposes. This did not require divine direction. As a matter of fact, a divine being would have no business of reporting the numbers in a minutely detailed manner. The following are a few examples of the factual exaggerations that the Bible makes. The first example is in terms of the age to which people lived in the Tanakh times. Adam lived 930 years. His son Seth 912 years. Seth's son Enosh lived 905 years. Jared, a fifth generation descendant of Adam, 962 years. Noah, 950 years. And the oldest person reported by the Bible is Methuselah, who lived 969 years. These are all specific numbers and not round numbers. Now, there's a problem with these numbers. A controlled study conducted on the length of life in the ancient world reports that even with all the modern medical treatments and nutrition that we have today, the vast majority of people do not live 200 years. In light of that study, the age up to which these biblical people lived is truly an exaggeration. The question then is, why did the Bible lie? Well, the biblical authors did not think they were lying. All the Mediterranean cultures that subscribed to the flood theory believed that before the flood, the earth was covered by a canopy that enabled humans to live longer lives, and that the flood destroyed the canopy, reducing the lifespan as a punishment. A long earthly life was perceived to be a blessing for having pleased their respective deities. It was no different for the ancient Jews, who incorporated the pagan stories into their own narrative. If we take the Bible to be the handiwork of an intelligent divine being, we have a problem. The being would know that the earth had no such age-extending canopy over it during any time of its existence. For the Bible to say it had, either the inspirer of those passages was not all-knowing, or he was all-knowing and divine, but these passages were not his work. Either way, the writings are not divinely inspired. The second example is with regard to the numbers of people the Israelites had killed in wars. Now I have 5 of the most exaggerated accounts. Exaggeration 1. Samson killed 1,000 men in a single day with the jawbone of a donkey. That would mean killing 42 people an hour. For killings to happen in that manner, the enemies would have to queue up and come to get stabbed one by one. Let's say Yahweh blocked the enemy's mind from functioning and the enemies did queue up. The question then would be, what is the need for a jawbone? Samson could have punched in the air in his sleep and the enemies would have fallen dead wherever they were. The Tanakh writers were writing for posterity and they needed to elevate the heroes of the Jewish nation, and this was how they did it. Exaggeration 2. There were 700 men in the Israelite tribal army who could sling a stone at a hare and not miss it. This has to be a wishful thinking and not a historical truth, because if there were 700 such people in Israel's army, why would David have to rely on pagan army to win him wars? Now understand that pagans were the very people whom David's God, Yahweh, put to death for being pagan. Exaggeration number 3. The Israelites killed 100,000 Syrians in one day. The Battle of Somme, fought for 141 days during World War I, is known for its largest number of casualties in one day, and this stands at 57,000. The Battle of Stalingrad, fought for 6 months during World War II, claimed a total of 1,971,000 lives, making it an average of 10,950 deaths a day. Both these wars were fought in the 20th century, when there was more population in the world and where strikes were made by air, land and sea, with weapons like tanks, cannons, machine guns, which were much more advanced than what Israelites may have used to kill Syrians. In light of this historical truth, the biblical report of killing of 100,000 people in one day can only be an exaggeration. Now, exaggeration number 4. A city wall collapsed and killed 27,000 people. This has to be the most ridiculous account of all the killing accounts in the Tanakh. For a wall to fall on and kill 27,000 people, it would have to be either very tall or very wide or both. History does not record the existence of such a wall in that area. But let's say it was their God's doing, like they claim. Then the question would be, if Yahweh could command walls and doors to kill the enemies of his people, why couldn't he protect his own temple walls from being brought down by his enemies? Exaggeration number 5. This one has to be the most blatant one. It is a killing of 185,000 Assyrians in one night by an angel of Yahweh. If angels were fighting the Assyrians on behalf of the Israelites, where were these angels when the Jerusalem temple was being destroyed? Twice. Where were these angels when the Jewish temple state of Judah, the very epicenter of the religion of the God of the universe, was being reduced to a vassal kingdom? Now, the third example is in terms of the number of animal sacrifices. The story goes something like this. The third Jewish king, Solomon, builds the first Jewish temple. On the occasion of its dedication, Solomon organizes a feast of dedication wherein he is reported to have sacrificed 142,000 animals. The only thing the Bible mentions is that the feast went on for 7 days and the crowds were dispersed on the 8th day. Now, Christianity does not see a problem with this report. It is argued that the sacrificing event went on for more than 1 day, probably 7 days, and that it was a collective sacrifice of all the Israelites and not just Solomon's. One thing is clear with this justification, and that is, even Christians find the sacrifice of 142,000 animals on 1 day by one person implausible. That's why the need to justify it. Well, there's no reason to believe that these sacrifices were carried on for more than 1 day, because the religious mandate for sacrifices on any Jewish festival, whether Passover or any other, is that sacrifices be made on the eve of the occasion, followed by a 7-day feast. Next, were all the 142,000 animals sacrificed by Solomon alone? Now, to answer this question, we will need to look into the reference itself. The reference is in the book of 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 61 through 66. And I am reading from the Orthodox Study Bible. Then the king and all the children of Israel offered sacrifices before the Lord. Now, this verse has to be taken as the overview of the sacrificing event, and this sets the tone for specifications in the next verse. Solomon made a sacrifice of peace offerings and offered it to the Lord, 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep. So the king and all the children of Israel dedicated the house of the Lord. Here the writer goes into specifications. This verse has to be interpreted as Solomon having made the sacrifice of all the 142,000 animals just by himself. The first reason is, if the writer meant that it was a collective sacrifice, it would have been mentioned like in the previous verse, something like, the king and the children of Israel made a peace offering of 22,000 bulls and 120,000 sheep. He doesn't do that. When he is talking about the sacrifice, he mentions the name of only Solomon, and he doesn't add the children of Israel to this sacrifice. The second reason is, in general, as I already mentioned, the focus of the Tanakh writers was to always elevate the heroes of their race. Solomon is the hero of this part of the text, and this was one of their opportunities to brag about his might. Speaking of the sacrifice in collective terms would not achieve their purpose. Thirdly, This was a very important celebration. Presumably, the entire Jewish community attended it and offered sacrifices. By that measure, 142,000 animals is a small figure for a collective sacrifice of both a mighty king and his numerous people. Therefore, the figure specified here has to be understood as Solomon's individual sacrifice. Now, verse 63 reads, "On that day, the king consecrated the middle of the court that was in front of the house of the Lord. There he offered the burnt offering, grain offerings, and the fat of the peace offerings, because the bronze altar that was before the Lord was too small to receive the burnt offerings and the peace offerings." Now, the phrase "on that day" here means on the day the massive sacrifice was made and the temple was dedicated. This means that the sacrifice was made all in one day. Now, verse 64 reads, "On that day Solomon made a feast, and all Israel was with him, a great assembly from the entrance of Hamath to the river of Egypt, before the Lord our God. In the house he built, eating, drinking, and rejoicing before the Lord our God for 7 days." Verse 66, "On the 8th day he sent the people away and blessed them." Not just the critics, but also modern translations of the Bible have recognized the implausibility of Solomon alone making such a massive sacrifice on one day. So how did they overcome that? They did what they always did. They forged by adding the words 7 days and even 14 days. This version in modern translations reads, "At that time," note here that it doesn't say "on that day," it says "at that time Solomon held a feast for all Israel, a great congregation from the entry of Lobo Hamath to the brook of Egypt, before the Lord our God. 7 days and another 7 days, a total of 14 days. But then, the very next verse poses a problem to this addition, exposing the fraud of later translations. In all the translations, without exception, this verse reads, "On the 8th day, he sent the people away and blessed them." Do you see the problem? In light of this piece of internal evidence, this verse has to be understood as 142,000 animals sacrificed in one day, followed by only 7 days feast. Interestingly, of the 53 different English versions of the Bible found online, just 13 versions mention the duration of the dedication event as 7, and the rest report it as a 14-day event. Now, the Septuagint and the Masoretic text mention it as a 7-day dedication event. I have spelled out in my earlier videos what the Septuagint and the Masoretic text are, but let me repeat it here. The Septuagint is the earliest extant Greek translation of the Tanakh from the original Hebrew made for the Jewish community in Egypt when Greek was the common language throughout the region. This was also followed by the early church. The Masoretic text, on the other hand, refers to the authoritative version of the Hebrew Bible used universally by Jews today. The Orthodox Study Bible that I refer to here is close to the Masoretic text. Now, why does a person exaggerate? It is either for bragging, or to create buzz around an otherwise mundane event, or simply to cheat. Whatever the motive, the need to exaggerate arises from the intense feeling of inferiority complex and insecurity by the person making it. It indicates irrationality and stupidity. Irrationality because he lacks the capacity to estimate scopes, magnitudes, extent of things he is reporting, and stupidity because he thinks he can get away exaggerating. Do the biblical authors fit the bill? Yes, they do. From Jewish history, both in the Tanakh and from the sources outside the Tanakh, we can see that the Jews were relatively a powerless race who consistently lost wars with mighty nations and were often taken away as war captives or were exiled. But their aspirations were sky high. They aspired to establish their theocracy in the region. The Jewish priests and prophets were the leaders of the theocratic movement. Now, all these numbers make perfect sense if read in the historical context. They don't cease to be exaggerations, but they at least can be justified, and the God of the Bible can be absolved of lying and boasting. The Tanakh writers certainly knew that they were writing for themselves and not for the whole world. They had no clue that their religio-political anthology that they were compiling for use by their own race would one day be stolen and corrupted by another fringe group to build their own cult that would eventually become a world religion. They had no clue that their chosen deity, Yahweh, would be forced down the throats of the people of the whole world by this another cult group. This overarching view can be summed up in the poignant words of Lloyd Gaston, an eminent theologian of the early 1900s. The Christian Old Testament was preserved for the church at the cost of stealing from Israel its scriptures, its God, its name and election, and the principle of antithesis was written into central Christian affirmations. A divine being neither has the need to boast or to create buzz about his own might, nor does he suffer from inferiority complex and insecurity. Now, he created scopes and magnitudes, and therefore he wouldn't err in estimating them. Hence, there is no doubt that these parts of the Bible were purely a figment of primitive and irrational human imagination, stemming out of the need to portray a false might. This makes the Bible human, and all claims to its divine origin must be rejected. Thank you all for watching. I will see you in another episode. Until then, happy researching. Namaste.